What interested me was the fact that sugar is a material that cooks have been using for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's among the foods that we work with relatively pure. So most foods are mixtures of different chemicals, different substances. Sugar is pure, pretty much. It's 99.9% sucrose. And so you would think that with all those generations of experience and that simplicity, that it would be something that we understood everything about. There was nothing new to learn about sugar. And yet, a year and a half ago, someone pointed out, this is a chemist, that sugar doesn't behave the way other pure substances normally do. That if you try to melt it and let it solidify again, the melting point changes. It's not constant. And for something that's pure, that's very unusual. And so they looked more carefully at it and discovered that even at room temperature, sugar is kind of falling apart. It's turning into caramel very slowly at room temperature, but it's changing. And so that made me realize that if I could put sugar crystals in an oven at a relatively low temperature for a long time, a couple of days, that I could make those crystals caramelize without melting. And that's something that no cook had ever realized before, and I'd never realized it before. So in the 21st century, we still have so much to learn about the simplest aspects of our foods. And of course, the complex aspects of our foods are still, I think, beyond us. So it's always fascinating to me to see how cooks who are working at the edges of their craft are pushing those boundaries of what we know and what we don't know, and sometimes discovering aspects of foods that scientists are still trying to figure out. Usually when it's presented in a dish in restaurants, it's presented cooked, and if anything, the fact that it's blood is kind of quiet. It's downplayed. They don't make a big deal of it. They describe the dish. They don't really talk about the blood. And the thing about the dish that was presented last night was that blood was not only made an important part of it, but the servers came around and put droplets of not blood, but it was meant to look like blood. And yes, we all were taken aback, which I think, again, is wonderful because it's a way of, again, taking ingredients and foods that are familiar to us and making them strange in a positive way. It makes you stop and think, what is this really? And what am I tasting really? Maybe I should pay more attention to what I'm tasting. I guess what I would say is that not having experienced it before, experiencing it for the first time, I think it took us a while to get used to the situation, to adjust to the many different things that were going on, and to remember to pay attention to all of them. Because I do think it's true, maybe this is a neurobiological fact, that at any given moment, I think you have to focus on one thing or another. So if I found that when I had something in my mouth and I was trying to taste it, I almost had to close my eyes to shut everything else out because the flavors were very intense, complicated. I wanted to understand what was going on in there, and to try to do that while also seeing the images and so on was difficult. So automatically, I closed my eyes and shut out part of the experience. So it does seem to me that in an experience like this, there's a kind of ebb and flow of attention, so that you pay attention to one thing between courses, and then when the food comes, you pay attention to its appearance, and then when you put it in your mouth, I do think you kind of shut everything else out to pay attention more, but then you open your eyes and the flavors are still in your mouth and the images are there, and maybe you can then begin to integrate them with each other. I think this is the kind of thing that will keep neurobiologists busy for a few decades because I think it's very complicated how the brain deals with so many different things, especially when the images and the sounds are so emotionally charged. If they were neutral, then I think it wouldn't be maybe such a big deal. But the fact that they are demanding, that there's movement, and that what you see on the walls is not the same as what you see on the table. I do think that there is this. It's a complex process where the attention is shifting from one thing to another, and I think for the artists, for the craftsmen who make the experience, that's also something to keep in mind, to make sure that the things that are important to them are situated in the experience in a way that makes it possible for us to pay proper attention. A couple of us talk a little bit about meditation during the course of the meal. That is, making ordinary time stand still so that you can pay more attention to something more essential, not something that's just kind of floating by all the time, but something that's actually important and part of you. And I suppose people would use different words. Spiritual would certainly be one of them. But presence and attentiveness and all those things are so easily lost in everyday life. And restaurant dinners are a part of everyday life. So unless you go to a place where there's a conscious effort to make you feel that you're in a different place, that this is a restaurant, but it's also not a restaurant, or it's a restaurant, but we want you to approach the experience in a different way. Ordinarily, we just don't have that opportunity. And I suppose another way of, I have two minds about this, about the experience last night. One is that, in a way, there was too much for us to take in. On the other hand, you could also look at it as the creators were giving us the gift of many different things, and we could take from it whatever we individuals in that moment felt resonated with ourselves. And so that would be different for different people. And some people would be struck perhaps by the imagery. Some people might be struck by the taste. Because we're all eating in slightly different ways, one of us might be eating during a pause in the intensity of the imagery, where someone else would be having a different kind of correlation between the two. So on the one hand, I certainly felt, I need to pay attention to everything. I need to take in as much as I can. But maybe if this were an experience that I had more than once, I could kind of relax and just take in what made sense for me to take in at that moment. And the rest would be available, but not necessary.